have looked at China differently than everyone else. In late 2019, when everyone thought China was hot, you said China's not so hot. In 2022, when everyone said, in 23, China's a train wreck, you said, hold on. So tell us about the methodology, tell us about your company and the methodology behind what you do.
Yeah, I mean, the methodology is the key thing. So we are quite literally the only company in the world that does large-scale private surveys in China. And Jim, I know you're familiar with a lot of what we do, but for the sake of the audience here, we survey every month around about 1,500 Chinese companies. And we survey unique companies every month throughout the course of the year, meaning that we go through around about 20,000 odd Chinese firms. And we're serving senior business decision makers within the questionnaire that goes out to them. And if you survey every part of the Chinese economy geographically, sectorally, across the ownership divide, state, private, large SMEs, so forth, you can walk away knowing quite a lot of valuable information. And turns out your views might be a little bit different than what the consensus tends to be.
And who's the audience for your surveys?
The buyers, if you will, it's
who do you send the surveys to?
So these are senior decision makers across 34 different subsectors. We got manufacturing firms covered, commodities, the property market, construction firms, realtors, that sort of thing, on and on, services, retail, that sort of thing. So the entire economy is covered. We don't do the thing where we're going to do only a particular region or only a particular sector. We're doing the whole thing.
And how many data points on average do you get each month?
We have over 100 indicators. So we have, if you look at the database, millions upon millions of rows of data in there. And we've been doing this, by the way, since 2012. So this is very big.
Okay. So this is an energy, offshore, and a little bit of shipping audience. So they care about commodities. Let's talk about the aspects of China that impact commodities, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, a couple of important points here. First of all, our views on the commodities market have been very, very different from what the consensus has been. All of last year, and I want to pull back and quickly talk about last year here, there was a view out there that the Chinese economy was sort of on the verge of a collapse in the second half of last year. A big chunk of the narrative that was driving that was that Chinese industrial activity is falling apart. And if you were reading the research that was coming out of the banks, or if you were just tracking the PMI, you would absolutely believe that. Except if you looked under the hood, what you would find is that there was a ton of industrial activity taking place in China. The manufacturing sector was actually doing quite well. We're talking about overcapacity and China dumping its products abroad today. Well, all this was happening in plain sight last year when the consensus was, oh, the manufacturing firms, Chinese factories, they're on the verge of a collapse. The same thing applies to the commodities side. Far more steel out there, far more copper out there than anybody realized. And going into this year, one of the things we've been telling our clients is there's actually a ton of copper in China right now, more than you would realize. There's a ton of aluminum in China right now, more than you would realize. So this idea of Chinese factories pulling back on production, there being some kind of a deficit ahead, which tends to make its way into the narrative, it has over the last few months, is pretty seriously divorced from reality.
Take us through the last year in terms of what you've seen in Chinese banks' willingness to lend to various commodity-related sectors.
Yeah. There's a bigger China stimulus conversation that has been going on. The flip side of China is falling apart tends to always be the PBOC, or Beijing, or the Communist Party are going to step in, and they're going to pump a ton of stimulus into the economy to resuscitate growth. And both on the monetary policy side and, of course, through large-scale fiscal measures and projects and so forth. If you look at the monetary side of the equation, across the economy, money has been available to manufacturing firms, to commodities producers, and they have been borrowing. Manufacturing firms, again, this ties into my previous comment, have had preferential access to credit in our data, and they've actually been one of the few firms, or one of the few sectors, I should say, that have gone out there and accessed credit, which actually makes them unique, because one of the other aspects of this conversation, which is, again, not completely understood, is that there has been a ton of monetary policy easing in China, and sectors have taken advantage of it on the industrial side. But outside of that, you haven't had firms go out there and borrow at levels they used to borrow at. And you really haven't seen monetary policy kind of resuscitate, or I should say drive growth or power the economy the way it once did. It's largely because firms outside of the sectors I just mentioned have not been expanding, have not been investing at prior rates. And so they're quite frankly not going out there and borrowing, regardless of how much easing there has been, how cheap loans are today than they used to be.
About 3 months ago, your firm put out a paper on electric vehicles, and you gave me permission to send it to other people. There's some people in this room that received a copy of that. I thought that paper was really interesting. Take us through what China is doing, both in terms of volumes and what they're doing in terms of price points and what they're doing in terms of the materials, et cetera.
Yep, sure. A big chunk of what we do outside of the macroeconomic forecasting or tracking, rather, I should say, is, of course, the policy coverage. And as part of our policy coverage, both to keep policymakers in Washington, D.C. informed and to keep the policy conversation informed, we said, hey, how about we do a deep dive on the Chinese electric vehicles market? Most people probably in the room are very familiar with what has happened there, but the main piece of the conversation there was to establish just the large amount of subsidies that went into putting Chinese EVs together, and what the reality of the market is today when we think about how do you deal with the influx of Chinese electric vehicles, specifically in Europe, of course, but we were thinking of it more from the US standpoint. We're talking about tariffs. They've had 24% tariffs. Those have been ramped up. You could put 100% tariffs. You could put 200% tariffs. But as a matter of fact, Jim, I'm quoting you. If a car starts out at $9,500, $9,900, making it $20,000 is not going to really cut it. And that was, by and large, the key takeaway that when we think about tariff policy in Washington, D.C., as complicated as that conversation is getting, and by the way, there's much more coming ahead. As you know, we very firmly believe, and I certainly do, we're on the cusp of a bigger trade war in 25. So a lot of that fits into that piece.
Go into more detail and make it more, quantify the kind of numbers, the production levels, global market share we're talking about from China, just as relates to EV.
Look, I quite frankly can't remember the specifics right away, but an overwhelming part of the global EV market is, of course, is heavily Chinese dominated. I had a colleague recently come back from a trip to Southeast Asia, and one of the first things he said is, Shehzad, there are Chinese EVs everywhere. Right, we hear the same thing out of Latin America. There are, I think, a lot of Europeans in the room who probably know this better than I would. I don't think I need to tell them. We so far haven't seen that, but that could change out here, right? There's that big, what I like to call the Mexico loophole. All the tariff policies being considered by that the president has put into place, that President Trump had, or a future president would, will continue to struggle with that Mexico loophole problem.
So two additional questions around that. The electricity power in China, 2/3, 70% powered by coal.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, just touch on the quality of these EV vehicles and why China's not late to a good party this time.
So I have never driven a Chinese EV myself, but there are a certain amount of quality issues that, of course, certainly come up. But again, there tends to be the pushback that, look, who first of all, the quality of Chinese EVs generally all right, I'm told, but that who cares, again, that the price point being where it is not a fight over necessarily quality here per se. All right, so that's I think the extent to which I can probably reasonably comment on.
Yep.
That is, yeah.
Let's go back and spend some time on Chinese stimulus.
Yeah.
Because a year ago we would get headlines every week and we got very little stimulus. What were we seeing last year? What are we seeing now? What do you expect? I got to stop turning my head because my microphone's here.
So stimulus, there are two sides of it. I'm sort of mentioned that a second ago. The first idea, of course, was the one that we're used to. So what have we typically been trained on for the last, I don't know, call it under 30 years, 25 years? Economy gets into trouble, stimulus kicks in. What does that mean? Big infrastructure projects, highways, roadways, ports, that kind of thing. That is over. That model of Chinese economic growth is done. And the party has made a decision a few years ago, at least, if not a little bit longer, to no longer rely on that kind of growth. And what that means is that when the economy begins to slow, and the economy, by the way, is going to be growing sub 5%, there's no question about that in our minds, the party is not going to step in and all of a sudden start new projects, rev up new big large-scale fiscal projects. So that old model of Chinese economic stimulus that we've been trained on or are used to thinking about, we need to let go of that. So what does that look like now? First of all, it looks like stimulus is going to be much more modest in nature. All of last year, we heard the word stimulus being thrown around all over the place, but we saw very little actual fiscal stimulus take place in China. The second part of the equation, which I also mentioned briefly earlier, is monetary stimulus. There, we have seen quite a bit of activity take place. There has been a significant amount of easing that has taken place in China over the last 2 years now. So all of last year, companies were consecutively, one quarter after another, we could see this across every sector, borrowed at rates that were far lower than they had the year before, or really quite honestly at any time previously, at least in a long time. The problem was not rates. The problem was also not lenders not willing to lend. They were generally willing to lend. The problem was companies and their outlook for the economy being much more bearish and leading to a situation where hiring is very slow, investment is trickling in, and therefore there's no need to go out there and borrow in large quantities. So monetary policy, it's sort of akin to pushing on a string, as I believe I've said before, and has not been terribly successful at stimulating the Chinese economy. And that's the lens through which we urge our clients and others to understand and think about Chinese stimulus.
Hopefully there's some holes left and you haven't told everything in terms of what you currently believe about China and where we're going next. So this will probably be the last question we have. What are you seeing in China right now and what do you expect next?
Yeah, so the economy actually got off to a pretty decent start this year. Over the first quarter, almost sector-wide, across the economy. We saw lots of improvement, and our thought was, okay, what happens now? Can they sustain this pace of growth, or do we start to see a slowdown coming through? We just concluded our survey, or we're just about to conclude the survey for June, and I did do a little bit of a sneak peek before coming here this morning, and I'm seeing quite a bit of resilience, especially outside of property, for sure. There's quite a bit of resilience in the economy, which means that we are probably a little bit at least, if not a lot more positive on the Chinese economic picture for the year. Second half is going to be critical. Our view is that we probably get a cyclical bottom in the property market this year. And if that happens, expect a much more positive China story than we're getting now. But a lot of measures have been put into place, and chances are that over the last year and a half or so, and I think the cumulative effect will pretty sure result in a cyclical bottom. Not a long-term, not a structural situation, but cyclical bottom in the property market.
So this will definitely be the last question. Okay. So imports and exports, activity versus the U.S. has come down. Yeah. Exports out of China last year, not particularly strong. What do you see in terms of imports and exports going forward now? We talk about new productive forces. Well, the
President Xi talks about new productive forces, they're absolutely doubling down in China on the manufacturing sector, on the industrial economy. Of course, selective parts of it, high-end manufacturing and so forth, is very important. That said, even outside of that, they have absolutely been relying on the industrial sector to drive growth. There's no question about that. We've seen that on the commodity side, and that continues through 2024, and I see that pattern absolutely continuing. All that is happening is that the trade has been rerouted, as I think several of us know. So things that would come directly from China are making their way in through Southeast Asia. They're making their way in perhaps through Mexico and so forth. But exports are absolutely critical to the Chinese economy, and they did quite a bit to, I think, buoy growth last year.
Thank you very much. I
Thank you,
appreciate your views.